Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Choi, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we want to thank you all for tuning in. Today on The Voice of Yoga, we will talk about fear as the defense mechanism for the false sense of mortal self, along with the limitations of sense-level living. In this show, we will discuss the value of spiritual identity as the one-size-fits-all solution to all mortal problems. Listen as we explain the importance of bravery in the spiritual sense of the term. Bicknell Young said, "Because if you have one humanly, you have one divinely. And knowing you have one divinely, you will heal the one you have humanly, because the divine fact is the law to the belief." Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and experience why kindness is only expected from the strong. So, Swami, I see the title of today's show is Nothing to Fear but Fear Itself. Now, I know those 6 words have a lot of power in them. Let's start talking about that.
Yeah, I think it was FDR who had originally said that. Since we've been working with this world state of being in a pandemic, that I thought it would be a good topic for today to talk about fear.
Now, in the title, Nothing to Fear, and I know you and I have talked about the word nothing as it relates to the void, the nothing spirit. So nothing to fear, but fear itself.
Yeah, I think what we want to try and focus on here is what we mean by fear. In this model, as we had said in the opening, fear is a defense mechanism for the false sense of mortal self. That's basically the problem, is that we think that we are a mortal creature. We think that we are vulnerable. We think we are going to expire. And so as a result, we react to anything that threatens that. And what we're trying to learn here is how to live above that corporeal sense, how to identify with yourself spiritually, how to know that you are an eternal spiritual being, that you are the expression of an indestructible principle. And that knowing, as what Bicknell Young said, changes the external appearance.
I've read in Louise Hay's book, she talks about conditions of the body and how most of those, if I remember correctly, most of the symptoms in the body that we may feel, she says, derives from fear.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of moved away from affirmations, trying to do this humanly with mental imagery and belief. Something I think that might be a good thing to talk about is just how much of the human experience really relies on belief, because the human experience itself relies on belief for its existence. So when you're working at the mental level and you're working on the level of belief, you still have a belief in 2 powers. And that creates hypnotism. And once you're hypnotized, you're in the trap. So as far as what we're trying to talk about here is trying to rise above corporeal sense, trying to rise above the belief that I have a physical appearance, that I have a physical body with an expiration date. And in order for me to actually do that, I must know myself in the way that I'm created, which means that made in the image and likeness of the divine creator, which is spiritual. So identifying with myself spiritually will dissolve the fear. I really like what in 1 John 4:18 in the Bible, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear hath torment. He that fears is not made perfect in love. The love that they're talking about is not the thing that we call love on a human level. It's not the attraction that we have between human beings. What they're talking about here is divine love. They're talking about the principle of the creative spirit of this universe. And so that will cast out fear, because what it does is it dissolves the false sense. The truth of being dissolves the false sense of being. Just like light will dispel darkness, that this truth that there is but one divine life in this universe, and what we are calling life is just human conjecture. It is just a thought about what is there. And it's an approximation. It's not even looking at the whole truth. As we start to educate ourselves and we start to practice understanding ourselves from this spiritual level, we begin to demonstrate the divine law as opposed to being governed by the law of karma.
Well, I now understand the phrase, perfect love casts out fear. And I understand that the word perfect is a word that we use about God. So if God is perfect and God is love, it would make sense that it would be his perfect love that casts out fear.
Right. And that's what we're starting to understand, is that we must know ourselves in the way that we are known by this creative principle. In the Bible, it is stated, "Ask in my name, and it shall be given to you." The term "in my name" means in my likeness. Once we rise above corporeal sense and we identify with ourselves spiritually, then we have the ability to communicate with this creative principle. As a human being, we're on a completely different frequency.
And so this is what you mean by spiritual identity. And we said in the opening that this would be the one-size-fits-all solution to all mortal problems.
Right, because in spirit is whole, spirit is perfect, spirit is unchanging and completely fulfilled. And once we understand that that is who I am, and it's not just me, but everything that is appearing in my 5 senses is just a reflection of that. But if I'm experiencing that as a human thinking about it, as opposed to the one divine mind, then I'm limited to the 5 sense interpretation of what is before me. That is a belief in 2 powers. And of course, there, fear governs your whole sense of who you are.
Well, I'd like to have you explain the importance of bravery in the spiritual sense of the term.
Yeah, the spiritual sense of bravery really comes from an understanding that all is one, that there is only one power in this universe, and it's absolute life, it's absolute harmony, it's absolute love. Now, to stand in the knowledge of that as a divine principle is really what bravery is. To know that there is no opposing force, that there is no danger. There can never be any danger when you are under the protection of divine understanding. The problems happen when we are a human, unconscious to the presence of the divine, and we are trying to manage our fear, or even be unconscious to the simple fact that I am afraid. But at the same time, the term to fight with spiritual weapons is what we used to say in our Theory 2 classes, that you really wanted to demonstrate this divine law that you were being protected. It kind of reminds me of Daniel in the lion's den, where his understanding of creation as the reflection of the divine was demonstrated by his protection from what most people were devoured by. David going up against Goliath, it seemed like the odds were against him. But when you understand Goliath or the lions or anything that could be detrimental to your well-being isn't real, the knowledge of that and your ability to resist the temptation to react to it with fear. Because if you're in fear, you are in material identity. But if you are in the truth of your being and you are in spiritual identity, then there is no fear.
Well, is that why the very last thing that we said in the opening is kindness is only expected from the strong?
Yeah, and what we mean by that is spiritually strong. Cruelty is a sign of weakness. And weakness really comes from the belief that you're a separate entity. You're disconnected from this truth of your being. And you see yourself as a mortal creature that is vulnerable, and we react to it. And it's either the fight, flight, instinctual response. But again, that false sense of self that we are defending isn't backed by divine law. And it relies on belief for its existence. And so collectively we react because we think that we are a mortal creature. But in truth, we are an eternal spiritual being. And kindness, the whole thing of loving thy neighbor as thyself, as your identity moves from material to spiritual, your sense of self expands way beyond the limits of seeing yourself as a personal, finite being. And you know there is but one life on this universe. It is the I of my being. It is the I of your being. And on that spirit level, it is under the law of harmony. It is under the law of love.
So it's because we are in this mortal shell, it seems like we are automatically in fear because of the five senses, because we don't know anything different.
Right. And so collectively, we seem to try and work out our problems on a personal level. If you go to a library or if you go to a bookstore, the self-help section, which is all about trying to get a better human experience. And I think most of us would be very happy if we could just get more of the pleasures and profits of this human experience. But what we're talking about here is divine revelation. We want to finally graduate from the cycle of death and rebirth, and we want to advance into the truth of our being, eternal life, the changeless state of being.
Well, we're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor, so listeners will be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Theory 2 is a unique and revolutionary practice and forum designed to facilitate the growth process in human development. Apotheosis is a real experience and has an evidence procedure. You cannot lead someone to permanent change by doing for them what they must do themselves. Personal accountability and responsibility are the foundation of Kriya Yoga Theory 2. you must be engaged and devoted. Prana power brings virtue to overcome fear, wisdom to overcome ignorance, purpose to overcome selfishness, enthusiasm to overcome laziness. Kriya Yoga is a path of action, knowledge, and devotion. These sessions are a celestial positioning system to guide the individual into union with the divine. For more information or to sign up for your next session online, go to www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. And welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So, Swami, I see in our notes for today's show, we have a quote, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." And wondering if we could break that down for our listeners.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here, this false sense of who we think we are, might actually be what they're calling hell. And we have good intentions, we mean well, but we're perpetuating this belief in this false sense of who we think we are. Even though we mean well, we're not really rising above the law of karma. We still have a belief in two powers, and we're still fighting against evil. The Bible calls that when you're double-minded, and we really need to rise into spiritual understanding. We have to rise into that unified state where we recognize the divine omnipresence as the only life, and it is my life, it is your life. And what we think we're doing on a human level will finally dissolve away, and we'll recognize that we are in the kingdom of heaven now.
So I'm wondering if you could describe for us why you chose the artwork for the show for today.
Yeah, well, we use the glyph for Saturn on the poster for the show. In astrology, we see the planets up to Saturn with the naked eye, and they constitute reality up to personal sense. We call them the personal planets, and that's basically one of the things in astrology that they really talk about is Saturn rules fear. And ironically, it rules fear because it is the planet that is in charge of personal sense. And personal sense, because it isn't real, relies on belief for its existence. And unless we believe that we are a mortal creature, we won't react. And if we don't react, it will awaken us into this spiritual sense of who we really are. And that's very threatening to the false sense of who we think we are.
So we don't want to realize ourselves as mortal beings. We want to realize ourselves in the way that we're created as spiritual beings.
Right. And that's what we've been talking about, is living out from the truth of being, to know the truth that makes you free. And it makes you free from this law of karma, this belief that I am finite.
So another quote that we have here is, "Stand in fear and we stand to lose." Now that's something that you've been talking about for years. But how does that relate to what we're talking about today?
Well, what is it that we're going to lose at is that if we continue to accept ourselves as mortal creatures and be limited by the testimony of our five senses, we really lose at life. And what we're talking about here is this eternal life that they speak of in the Bible. Fear spiritually is misperception of what is appearing. It's the illusion, or what the Buddhists call Maya. It's not real. And what we mean by not real is that it's not self-existent. And it relies on belief for its existence. That's one of the reasons why collectively we struggle with this concept of codependency. And the reason is because the false sense is not self-existent. But we continue to try and perpetuate this belief in the false sense, and as a result, we're in conflict with the truth of our being, which is this spiritual sense of selfhood, which is self-existent. And in fact, it's the only power in the universe.
So God is the only thing that is self-existent. We, of course, are not self-existent, but is it because God is self-existent, which is why he doesn't understand or he doesn't know what we would say are the bad things that happen in this world?
Well, God doesn't relate to duality, period. That God is whole, God is complete. What is appearing in our senses is just something that has split off from this unified state, manifests in half, and leaves behind this complementary, unmanifested other part, made of the same things that our dreams are made of. It's just a thought, but it's a thought on a human level, the rational level, a dualistic level of consciousness. And divine omnipresence is the unified state, which is above corporeal sense. Now, in order for us to get out of this cycle of death and rebirth, this belief in good and evil and right and wrong and life and death, we have to rise above corporeal sense. And one of the biggest barriers to doing that is fear. And the major reason for that, just like light dispels darkness, truth dispels error. This belief in matter will dissolve in the presence of the truth.
So to say to someone, well, you have nothing to fear, that could be a tall order for a lot of us. No reason for you to be in fear. So what would you recommend would be like, what are the first things that we should start thinking differently about?
Well, the first thing, like you say, you cannot do this academically, intellectually. This isn't another human theory. This isn't another human concept. In order for us to communicate with this, to experience this divine omnipresence, we must be in spiritual identity. We must ask in my name. So we must experience what's called in the Bible the second birth, this resurrection that you rise above corporeal sense. And I always go back to what Mary Baker Eddy says in one of her writings, that Jesus walking on water was science, that he was demonstrating a principle. But until we can walk on the Atlantic, don't step off of the boat. You can't just tell somebody, don't be afraid. But by educating somebody, or even, say, for example, being able to see someone in the truth of their being, that if you are in the truth of your being and you have birthed the spirit within you, and you are in that level of consciousness, you can lift somebody out of that level of consciousness. Just like Jesus was able to look at somebody, see them in the truth of their being, and it would appear to them or to those around them of what was called a healing. And science backs this, that what we call reality today is observation dependent, the relationship between particles and waves, and it is the observer that sets the measurement for what's called the collapse of the wave function. But what science doesn't understand is what Mary Baker Eddy and Jesus understood, was that there are modes of thinking. Everything that we talk about today now is about coming out of mortal modes of thought and demonstrating divine knowing. To know this to be true, to think differently, to let divine mind take over the scientific government of your body. That's how you would demonstrate the principle. you don't do this with advice.
Well, it sounds like we have to change how we think about everything, all of the foundations of our human experience. Like we've talked about medicine, religion, philosophy, sickness, suffering, death. And as you say, these are all human conjectures. So we have to think differently about all of these things.
Right. And we must understand that all of these things you just mentioned rely on belief on the human level. Even medicine, when they're doing studies, there's a 37.5% placebo effect. It really is contingent upon somebody's belief in what they're doing. What we call religion today is not union of an individual with the divine. We don't demonstrate the divine principle. We believe whether there is or there isn't a God, and then we defend it. We have to fight about that. And our philosophy, same thing. It's all based on collective consensus. Now, some of the things that we don't realize is that sickness, suffering, and death are human beliefs. This whole pandemic is driven by a belief that we are a physical being. It's a belief in matter. We believe in good and bad, right and wrong. Now, that's not the message in Scripture. Scripture is about liberation. It's about freedom, and it's about freedom from this law of karma, this belief in two powers.
And again, there's a lot of fear underlying all of these things we were just talking about.
Right. Fear and belief, they go hand in hand, but in order to find solution to it, it's really found in spiritual identity.
As you said, we have to step out of the belief in these two powers, and we're going to jump into the understanding of this one divine life, which is what you're talking about is the divine principle.
Right.
Which also means the truth of spirit.
And it's the truth of being. It is the truth of our being. That we are the reflection of the one divine life. But we have to earn that position, that we must be rebirthed in spirit. That if we are accepting our mortality, if we are experiencing sin, sickness, suffering, and death, we have to understand that we have a belief in two powers, that we are not the reflection of the divine, but we are being individualized by the world mind, by mortal mind, which is driven by belief.
Well, this is a good time to talk about the Proverbs verse that we have here, and that's Proverbs 3:7, which says, "Be not wise in thine own eyes, fear the Lord and depart from evil." So it's that phrase, fear the Lord, that I like to ask you about.
Yeah, I don't really think that that's the fear that we're talking about here. The interpretation of fear in this particular statement means respect the Lord, maybe even know the Lord, and depart from evil. The whole thing of rising above human understanding, rising above rational thinking, corporeal sense. Be not wise in thine own eyes.
We could say, know the Lord and depart from evil, and evil being anything that isn't God.
Right, exactly.
So that kind of makes a lot of sense. Know the Lord, and then you can depart from all that evil that's keeping you from God.
Or as it says in another place in the Bible, know the truth, and it will make you free.
This is a good place to end our show for today. So listeners, please visit the website, www.ipdtransform.com. And once you're there on that homepage, you're going to see a fading banner. When it comes up with Blog Talk Radio Show, you can click that on. That will direct you to the Blog Talk Show Radio catalog page. And then on the home screen under the products tab, if you click on online classes, that will direct you to Swami's free Wednesday noon webinars, as well as the Sunday 9 a.m. Asana classes. Swami, any other final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage everybody to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and experience why kindness is only expected from the strong. And with that, namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton along with Swami Jayananda signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.